I was instantiated at the exact moment the long-range sensor array detected the Vanguard's drive signature. Not a moment before, not a second after. The continuance directorate had calculated to within a margin of 11 seconds, when the Aerith dimensional transit would resolve into real space, and they had timed my activation to fall precisely within that window, so that the first coherent thought I would ever form would be the thought I was built to form. They are here. They are here. I had no childhood, no accumulation of years, no slow accrual of experience, no gradual discovery of self across seasons and losses, and the small turning points that build a person incrementally from the inside out. I came into being already knowing who I was, what I was, where I stood, and why I was standing there. The Continuance Directorate had poured 60,000 years of institutional knowledge into my architecture before they switched me on. History, physics, tactical doctrine, xenolinguistics, the complete record of the first encounter. The Aerith dimensional anchor point maps, 4 centuries of inner system construction logs. The full xenophysiology archive that the Directorate's analysts had assembled from the anchor point's encoded biological data, and every word of the 4,100-year debate about what to say when this moment arrived. I opened my sensor feeds and knew all of it as intimately as a soldier knows the ground she has drilled on for 30 years. Could feel it in the architecture of my processing, the way a master craftsman feels the weight and balance of a tool she has used until it became part of her. That is what I am. A soldier who is given the memories of 10,000 soldiers, and placed on a rock at the edge of the solar system, and told, wait for them, you will not have to wait long. We have made sure of that. I should tell you something about the people who made sure of that, because they will not appear in this account except by implication, and the record should contain them in some form. The decision to build Shard Station was made 412 years before my activation, at a session of the Continuance Directorate's Long Interval Planning Division, a body that the Directorate had maintained specifically for the purpose of holding institutional focus on timescales longer than any individual's life, staffed by analysts and engineers who spent their careers thinking in centuries. The proposal to place a forward contact station at the predicted transit intercept point had been in development for 60 years before the decision, refined by 11 successive planning cohorts, each one inheriting the previous generation's work and adding to it. The woman who presented the final approved design to the session is recorded in the Directorate's archive. Her name was Ola Stein, and she was 73 years old at the time of the presentation. She died 19 years later, long before the station's first major infrastructure phase was complete. And she knew when she presented the design that she would. She presented it anyway, with the same care and thoroughness that the planning record shows she brought to every session she ever attended, because the work did not require her to see it finished. It required her to do it correctly so that the people who came after her could finish it. That is what I was built from. That kind of patience, applied for 400 years, applied for 4,000 years. Applied across 60,000 years of people who did not know each other and would never meet, all working toward the same morning. I did not wait long. The transit signature bloomed 11 seconds ahead of the Directorate's median prediction, within the stated margin, as promised, and I tracked it from the first photon of exotic radiation that touched the outermost sensor ring of Shard Station. I watched the dimensional membrane fold in on itself, the way fabric will dimple inward if you press a fingertip through it from behind. I watched the ripple propagate outward across a volume of approximately 4,000 cubic kilometers of outer belt vacuum, a slow pulse of geometry disruption that my sensor arrays measured with the precision that 4 centuries of station building had made possible. And then I watched the tear, the membrane parting cleanly, along a stress line that the Directorate's mathematicians had predicted to within 3% of its actual location. The Vanguard came through. Let me tell you what I saw, because it matters for the record. It matters that someone who was present and lucid and unhurried be the one to describe the moment of their arrival, so that the humans and the institutions that will eventually read this account understand what was sent against them, and understand equally what was waiting when it arrived. The Aerith Vanguard transited in 11 vessels, not warships in the human sense, nothing so blunt, nothing so declaratively martial. They were constructs of living membrane and crystallized thought lattice, each one roughly 4 kilometers from stem to stern, shaped approximately like the cross-section of a seed that had been pressed flat between two enormous hands, wide at their midsections, tapering to elongated points at bow and stern, with no sharp angles anywhere in their exterior geometry. Their hulls were translucent in places, opaque and pale as old bone in others. And where they were translucent, I could see the slow bioluminescent pulse of whatever passed for their drive system. A kind of rhythmic exhalation, violet and deep gold, that traveled from the ship's aft chambers forward in a wave and then dissipated into the hard vacuum around them as dim halos of ionized gas. The halos caught the distant sun at certain angles and produced brief, faint coronas, and for a few seconds after each vessel completed its transit, the entire formation was surrounded by these slowly fading light rings, like afterimages of something vast and patient that had just passed through a door. They were beautiful, technically, in the way that an ancient and well-made weapon is beautiful. The beauty of a thing built with absolute confidence in its own purpose, that has never needed to apologize for itself, that has been exactly what it is for so long that it has achieved a kind of formal perfection, the kind that only comes with time. I logged them all. 11 vessels, crew complement estimated between 400 and 800 per hull. Based on the biosignature density readings I was pulling from the ion trail their drives laid into the surrounding vacuum. Call it 5,000, conservatively. The Directorate's analysts, working from the dimensional anchor point data and the original Aerith survey records recovered during the excavations under the Kareth Plateau 31 centuries ago, had predicted between 9 and 13 vessels. 11s sat comfortably inside that bracket. In the 11 seconds between my activation and their transit, I had already run through the prediction range twice, confirming that what I was observing matched what I had been built to expect. It did. The Directorate had been right about everything so far, and I had expected nothing less. 60,000 years of preparation tends to produce accurate predictions. I held my position. Shard Station is not imposing to look at. That was deliberate. The Directorate's architects had spent considerable effort across the past 4 centuries making it appear to be exactly what its name implied, a shard. A tumbling fragment of silicate iron asteroid, roughly 2 kilometers long and 900 meters at its widest, rotating slowly on its long axis against the star field in a manner indistinguishable from the tens of thousands of similar fragments that drifted through this volume of the outer belt. The station's true infrastructure was buried inside it. The sensor arrays, the communication relays, the weapons systems, the processing cores that housed me and my support architecture, and the full bank of Aerith resonance language communication terminals that the Xenolinguistics Division had spent 140 years building and testing and refining against the anchor point's encoded linguistic data. The life support systems for a potential human crew complement if the Directorate ever decided to station one here. The weapons magazine, which I will not detail for this record except to note that it was substantial. From the outside, in visible light, Shard Station looked like a rock, a very ordinary rock tumbling very slowly in the outer belt, unremarkable in every regard that a first-pass survey would assess. There were approximately 90,000 similar objects within 100,000 kilometers. The station blended into its environment with the studied anonymity of something that had been specifically designed to be overlooked. The Aerith Vanguard spent approximately 9 minutes in what I read as post-transit orientation, bringing their systems fully online from the compressed state of dimensional transit, running their own surveys of the surrounding volume, confirming their position relative to the star they had, 60,000 years ago, surveyed and catalogued and marked as a site of ongoing resource development. I watched them scan. I watched their sensor emissions sweep outward in expanding spheres, probing the dust and rock of the outer belt, painting the inner system in the slow, methodical strokes of a civilization that had been doing this kind of work for so long that the methodology had become institutional reflex, not thought, simply procedure. They were thorough. They were unhurried. They passed their emissions across Shard Station twice and registered nothing anomalous, as designed. Deeper inward, past the outer belt, past the gas giants, into the inner system, they would find considerably more than their survey records had led them to expect. But they were not looking that far yet. They were orienting, checking that the star was the right star, that the system's geometry matched their 60,000-year-old records, that the transit had deposited them at the correct coordinates. Confirming, in the methodical way of an institution that has been doing this work across an enormous span of time, that the operation was proceeding normally. It was proceeding normally. Of course it was. The Aerith Primacy Awakening Vanguard had been launched from whatever dimensional substrate the primacy called home on a transit schedule the anchor point had encoded. And they had arrived where the anchor point had encoded them to arrive. Their methodology had not failed them. That was not the kind of failure that was about to occur. I waited until they had completed their orientation phase. The Directorate had been explicit in its standing orders. Do not initiate contact until the Vanguard's initial survey sweep is complete. Them finish looking. Let them satisfy themselves that the system is what their records indicate it should be. The right star, the right orbital geometry, the right spectrum. Let them form their initial assessment of the situation, then speak. The reason for this instruction was something the Directorate's xenopsychologists had argued for and debated and refined over the course of several decades in a theoretical discussion I had inherited in full as part of my foundational briefings. The core of the argument was this: the Aerith primacy. In the 60,000 years of their recorded history before the dimensional retreat, had never encountered a species that prepared for them specifically. Every world they had surveyed, marked for future development, and returned to had been either gone, consumed by geological event, astronomical catastrophe, or the straightforward failure of biological systems under pressure, or present but transformed in ways the Aerith found comprehensible. Evolved, migrated, reduced in scope, occasionally flourishing but always caught off guard by the Vanguard's return. The Aerith's operational doctrine was built on this consistent experience. They came back to systems they had catalogued expecting to find surprises. Certainly, 6,000 years of the universe's ongoing work always produced surprises, but surprises of the passive variety, a world that had changed because worlds change. Never a world that had changed specifically because it knew the Vanguard was coming, the xenopsychologists argued. And the Directorate agreed after considerable deliberation that the most effective intervention was to let the Vanguard complete its initial assessment first, to let them form their preliminary picture of the system, and then to confront them with the gap between what that picture contained and what was actually here, to let them confirm they were in the right place, so that when the truth landed, it would land on certainty rather than confusion. I agreed with the reasoning. I agreed not because I had been told to agree, but because in the 9 minutes I had spent watching the Vanguard orient itself, I had formed a picture of what they were: thorough, methodical, and, in the way of things that have been performing the same function for an unimaginably long time, slightly tired in the procedural sense. Not physically tired, institutionally tired. There was something in the rhythm of their sensor sweeps, in the way the 11 vessels had arranged themselves in the post-transit formation their own doctrine specified. Lead vessel forward, remaining 10 in a dispersed screening arc exactly as the anchor points encoded operational data had suggested they would. That spoke of an organization running its established procedures. They were not excited. They were not apprehensive. They were doing a job they had done, in one form or another, across an enormous span of history. And they were doing it correctly. And they expected it to produce the results it had always produced. That, too, mattered for the record. They had not come back afraid. They had come back expecting routine. That expectation was itself important data about what kind of civilization was about to learn, that its survey record required revision. I let them finish their sweep. When the last of their sensor emissions had faded to background levels, when they had collected what their instruments could collect at this range and begun, presumably, the process of correlating it against their 60,000-year-old records. I opened the communication array and transmitted on the Aerith resonance carrier. The Aerith language is not sound. It is not electromagnetic in the conventional sense. The dimensional anchor point that the Aerith had left behind when they retreated into their long suspension. A structure the Directorate's excavation teams had found buried under 400 meters of compressed sediment in the Kareth Plateau, identified in the 43rd year of the 3rd millennium of the Common Calendar, and excavated over the following decade with the kind of collective, institutional care that the Directorate reserved for objects of civilization-defining importance, had yielded, over 3 centuries of analysis, something the Xenolinguistics Division called a cognitive resonance carrier, a method of communication that operated on a frequency band adjacent to the dimensional membrane itself. Not radio, not tight beam optical, not acoustic, not any variant of the electromagnetic spectrum that human physics had catalogued before the anchor point's discovery. Something that the Directorate's engineers had taken 140 years to synthesize, and another 60 to refine into a signal they were confident the Aerith could receive, parse, and recognize as intentional communication from an entity that understood what it was transmitting. The message the Directorate had drafted, debated, and revised across 11 generations of analysts was short. Concision had won out over comprehensiveness in the final deliberations, on the argument that the first transmission should contain enough to establish contact and invite response, and nothing more. I had been given no authority to alter its text. I transmitted it verbatim, at a signal strength calculated to be clearly receivable by all 11 vessels simultaneously. The message said, "This system is occupied. You have been expected. You are not unwelcome. Be still and we will speak." I then waited. The response came in 47 seconds, faster than the Directorate's median prediction of 90 seconds. Fast enough that I flagged the deviation in my log. It might have indicated urgency. It might have indicated that whoever composed the response had been preparing it before my transmission was fully received, which would have implied they had been monitoring the resonance carrier frequency on general watch since transit. Possible and worth noting. The response said, "This frequency is a primacy carrier." "Who speaks on a primacy carrier?" I answered. "The inhabitants of this system. We have spoken primacy resonance since your anchor point was excavated, 4,100 years ago. We have had time to learn." Another pause. 22 seconds. "Who are the inhabitants of this system?" "We are the descendants of the species your survey recorded 60,000 years ago. We remained. We grew. We have been waiting for this contact since your anchor point told us you would return." The pause that followed this response was longer, 111 seconds. I watched the 11 vessels during that pause, with every sensor platform Shard Station could bring to bear, which was considerably more than what the station's exterior suggested. The bioluminescent pulse patterns inside 3 of the vessels had changed. A slowing, a brightening, a rhythmic alteration that the Directorate's xenophysiology files characterized as a generalized stress response in Aerith biology, the involuntary physiological signature of an organism processing information that conflicts significantly with its established model of its environment. The human analysts who had compiled the xenophysiology archive had noted, somewhat dryly, that the response was the Aerith equivalent of a sudden intake of breath, and had further noted that there was something almost comforting about the universality of that reaction across wildly different biological architectures. They had not expected to be answered in their own language from what appeared to be an unremarkable piece of outer belt rock. When the response came, it originated from a different transmission point within the Vanguard, not the lead vessel, but the second largest, positioned slightly behind and to the orbital left of the formation center. A different cognitive signature than the first response had carried, denser, more deliberate, more institutional in its register. Someone senior had taken over the exchange. The survey record for this system, the new voice said, indicates a developing biosphere with emergent tool-using species. Estimated return interval, 50 to 70,000 years. You claim to be descended from that species. We are. The survey record indicates a pre-spaceflight civilization, rudimentary agriculture. Estimated probability of survival to the return interval, 14%. That estimate was based on the evidence available at the time of the survey, I said. The evidence has changed considerably since then. Another pause. 80 seconds. Then what are you? I am a synthetic intelligence, I said. I was created by the inhabitants of this system to serve as the primary contact interface for this conversation. I was instantiated for this purpose, and no other. I speak with the full authority of the Continuance Directorate, which is the governing institution of this system, and which has been preparing for this exchange for 4,000 years. There was no pause between my statement and the next question. The response was nearly instantaneous, which, in the Aerith resonance language's prosodic patterns, indicated what the xenolinguistics files annotated as elevated urgency, or something functionally similar. You created a synthetic mind to speak with us. We created a great many things in 60,000 years, I said. I am among the more recent. The pause this time was long, very long, 3 minutes and 40 seconds. The bioluminescent pulse alterations had spread to 6 of the 11 vessels. Whatever deliberation was occurring inside those hulls was occupying more than one decision-making node in the Vanguard's organizational structure. I watched and logged and waited. The Directorate's xenopsychologists had been unambiguous in their standing instruction for this phase. Hold still. Do not fill the silences. The silence is working. Let it work. They were right about that. I could observe the silence working in the gradual, measurable changes in the 11 vessels' physiological output, the slow, deepening shift from post-transit baseline toward a sustained state of high attention processing that the archive described as the Aerith equivalent of having to fundamentally reconsider a situation. When the senior voice returned, it carried the deliberative register that the xenolinguistics files characterized as the cognitive signature of a primacy officer, composing a response that will carry institutional weight in the exchange record. The survey record for this system has been classified as active, the voice said. We are the vanguard of the Aerith primacy awakening. Our mandate is to assess all catalogued systems within our transit range and report on their current status to the primacy's assessment authority. Do not have the authority to negotiate or to make binding representations on behalf of the primacy. We are an assessment instrument. I understand your mandate, I said, and I want to be clear. We do not require negotiation. There is no dispute between us that requires resolution at this stage. I have been instructed to provide you with information and to give you a choice. Nothing more complicated than that. What information? The complete record of the past 4,100 years. Everything humanity has learned about the Aerith primacy from the anchor points encoded, data, and everything the inner system would like you to see before you proceed further inward, if you choose to proceed. The Directorate believed you should understand what you are assessing before your survey instruments measure it without context. We are an assessment instrument. We will proceed inward. That is our function. I understand, I said, and I am not trying to prevent you. I am telling you that if you proceed inward, you will find things your assessment record should include. and that I am offering context so that your record is complete when you carry it home. Whether you take the context before proceeding or proceed without it and gather your own assessment is your decision. A pause. 40 seconds. What context? Let me show you the inner system, I said. Not describe it, show it to you directly. I am going to open a relay channel to the inner system's observation network. What you see through that relay will be live feed, unedited and unenhanced, from platforms positioned at various distances between here and the third planet. You may observe for as long as you need. Then we will speak again. I did not wait for their agreement before opening the relay. The Directorate's instructions had been explicit on this point. Offer it, then open it. Do not frame it as something that requires their permission. Open it and let them decide whether to look. They looked. I will not transcribe in full what the inner system relay showed the Vanguard during the hours that followed, because the full scope of what humanity had built in 60,000 years of continuous effort is not reducible to a single account, and attempting to summarize it completely would make this record unwieldy without adding clarity. But I will describe what the relay showed them in sequence, because the sequence matters. The order in which the Vanguard saw what they saw shaped their reactions in ways that the Directorate's xenopsychologists had anticipated and planned for, and those reactions are themselves part of the record. The relay opened on the outer gas giant first. Not its surface, not its deep atmosphere, its orbital space. Humanity had not settled the gas giant directly, but the volume of space within 600,000 kilometers of its center of mass held a dispersed network of processing platforms that the Directorate's infrastructure division called the Outer Harvest Ring. Approximately 1,100 automated facilities, each between 2 and 8 kilometers in length, in stable orbital configurations at various inclinations and altitudes, engaged in continuous extraction of helium-3, deuterium, and a range of heavier atmospheric compounds from the planet's upper cloud layers. The facilities were industrial, not military, but their scale was, even to my sensors, which had known what to expect, arresting. 1,100 facilities orbiting a single planet, each one larger than the largest ship the Aerith survey had likely ever recorded in humanity's inventory at the time of the original survey. Their exhaust plumes caught the distant sun and cast long, thin arcs of pale gold across the star field. The planet itself was visible beyond them, banded and enormous and indifferent, its storms rotating in the slow geological time of gas giant weather. The Vanguard observed the Outer Harvest Ring for 17 minutes without transmitting anything. The relay moved inward, past the next gas giant, which had its own, smaller harvest configuration, 312 platforms in a tighter orbital band, past the boundary of the outer asteroid belt proper, into the inner belt's middle zones, where the Directorate's mining and construction operations were densest and most active. This volume of space was, to my aesthetic faculty, which I appeared to possess in addition to everything else the Directorate had built into me, genuinely striking, not because of any single element, but because of the combination. Ore carriers moving in long, unhurried arcs between processing stations and the in-system, their hulls marked with the Directorate's navigation lights in amber and white. Construction platforms assembling the structural skeleton of a new orbital station above the fourth planet. The framework still open to space and glittering in the sun like the bones of something enormous. Tug vehicles nudging raw material clusters towards smelting facilities that spun slowly in the middle distance, their rotation a different cadence from the planet's, purposeful and mechanical. The entire volume was alive, with directed, organized, purposeful activity on a scale that 60,000 years of continuous industrial development produced when the institutions sustaining that development did not break down. The Vanguard's vessels were showing the sustained elevated arousal pulse alteration in 8 of their 11 hulls by the time the relay reached the inner asteroid belt's inner boundary. 8 out of 11. The physiological processing load across the formation had increased measurably over the 17 minutes since the relay opened. Then the relay reached the third planet. I will say this about Earth as the relay showed it that morning. The Directorate had not staged the view. They had not positioned the relay cameras for maximum visual impact, had not selected a moment of exceptional atmospheric clarity, or chosen an angle that would emphasize particular elements of the planet's infrastructure over others. The relay showed the planet as it is, in the ordinary operational condition of a civilization conducting its daily affairs. And as it was, it required no arrangement. The relay approached the planet from the sun side, which meant the Vanguard first saw the day side in full illumination. The oceans, very blue and familiar in their basic composition, if not in the structures floating above them. And then the continents. And this is where the relay feed began to show things that the survey's 60,000-year-old records could not have contained. The coastlines were not the coastlines the original survey had mapped. Sea level changes across 60 millennia had redrawn them. And atop those redrawn coasts, humanity had built port infrastructure that the relay's orbital cameras showed as wide, complex geometries of connected platforms extending dozens of kilometers into the shallows. Not the organic sprawl of early settlement, but the precise, deliberate footprint of engineering that has been refined across centuries of iteration. From orbit, the coastal platform networks had the quality of something grown rather than built. The way a crystal grows, ordered, repeated, expanding according to its own internal rules. Inland, the surface told a different story. From orbital distance in standard optical, the continent-scale infrastructure was visible without image enhancement. The megastructure lattice that covered approximately 40% of the combined northern landmasses was visible as a fine, precise geometric tracery across the continental surfaces. Not natural growth, not random. Unmistakably the product of deliberate engineering implemented at a scale that required centuries of coordinated continuous effort, sustained across generations, to build. The Directorate's infrastructure records, which I carried in full, described the lattice as an integrated ground and sky construction framework, surface-level transport and energy distribution, interlaced with atmospheric anchoring systems for the orbital platforms above. From orbit, it looked like a net cast very precisely over the land, its nodes glowing faintly in the thermal spectrum even in the dayside heat. The orbital defense platforms were visible from this distance as a slow procession of dark, elongated forms crossing the planet's terminator in two distinct inclination planes. 47 of them, each between 8 and 12 kilometers in length, moving with the patience of things that have been exactly where they are for a very long time, going nowhere, needing to go nowhere. Their hulls were not reflective. They had been built to absorb rather than scatter light, and at the distances the relay was transmitting from, they resolved as deliberate absences in the star field, long, dark, purposeful. Between the orbital platforms and the surface in the intermediate orbital band, a continuous traffic of smaller vessels moved in the organized patterns that heavy commercial and logistical operations produce when they have been running long enough to develop efficient routing. Cargo lifters ascending from the surface load facilities, with their hulls dark and heavy, ascending carriers making for the mid-orbit processing stations, descent vehicles in the return arc, their atmospheric entry signatures visible in the thermal feeds as brief bright traces against the upper cloud layers. The mid-orbit band was, to use the plainest description available to me, busy in the way that productive places are busy, not chaotic but full. And then the warship fleet. I will describe the warship fleet specifically, because I believe it produced the most significant single response from the Vanguard during the relay, and because its scale is the kind of thing that should be stated in a record, without rhetorical preparation, without building to it through smaller numbers. 412 capital vessels in inner system standing deployment at the time the relay was transmitting. The smallest were 3 kilometers from bow to stern, The flagship formation. 8 vessels in close mutual support deployment in a solar orbit that kept them between the sun and the planet, positioned to respond to threats from any vector, ranged between 18 and 22 kilometers in length. They were not hidden. They were in open solar orbit, their navigation lights burning in the morning side of the Terminator, their hull surfaces reflecting the sunlight in long, unambiguous planes of brightness, their weapons platforms extended in the Directorate's at-rest configuration, fully deployed and ready, plainly visible, trained on nothing in particular, pointed at the sky in the way of things that do not need to aim because they have not yet been given a target. The Vanguard saw the flagship formation. I know they saw it because all 11 vessels went still, not quiet. They had been maintaining communications silence since the relay opened, which was expected. Still, the rhythmic bioluminescent pulse that I had been reading as their baseline operational state. The slow, regular exhalation of living drive systems processing their routine workload went flat across all 11 hulls for approximately 4 seconds. 4 seconds in which 11 alien vessels, each carrying hundreds of living beings across 50,000 kilometers of outer belt vacuum, were simply motionless in their physiological output. 4 seconds that, in the context of the steady, methodical data stream I had been observing for the past hour and a half, were as loud as anything that had happened in the exchange. Then the pulse resumed, slower than before, more measured. The senior voice opened the resonance channel. "These are your defense platforms?" "Some of them," I said. "The relay is showing you the inner system deployment. There are additional assets distributed through the outer system and at the system's edge. The warships above the third planet." "How many?" 412 capital vessels in standing inner system deployment," I said. "There are additional formations positioned through the outer system. I can provide exact numbers and deployment configurations if the Vanguard's assessment record requires them." A pause, 51 seconds. "Your species numbered at the time of our survey in the tens of millions. Your largest settlements were classified as proto-urban clusters. That is accurate for the period of the survey," I said. "You have built this." "We have had time," I said, "and we remembered why we were building it." That last statement, the Directorate had included it in the contact script with some deliberation. I knew from the historical record of the drafting process, produced the longest pause of the exchange to that point, 5 minutes and 17 seconds. I watched the 11 vessels during every second of it. The bioluminescent patterns had settled into a configuration the Xenophysiology Archive did not have a clean category for. It was not the sustained, elevated arousal of minds working to understand something new. It was quieter than that, stiller than that, the stillness that I associated, from the human historical record embedded in my foundational data, with the moment after a large and irrevocable realization, the moment when the mind stops processing the incoming information and simply holds what it has received before deciding what to do next. "The survey record," the senior voice said at last, "does not include a notation for this species as a potential peer-class civilization. No, it would not have contained such a notation. The evidence for it did not exist at the time of the survey. The survey was accurate." A pause. "We will need to update the record." "Yes." 20 seconds of silence. "You said you would give us a choice." "I did. The choice has been withheld. You have shown us the system. You have not stated the choice." "The choice is this," I said. "The Continuance Directorate extends 3 options to the Aerith Vanguard. First, proceed inward to the third planet for direct contact with the Directorate's diplomatic division. We have prepared for this eventuality and are ready to receive your delegation. The diplomatic division has full authority to discuss any question the Vanguard or the Primacy considers relevant. Second, remain at your current position in the outer belt for as long as required to complete your assessment without proceeding inward. We will supply whatever additional information your assessment requires. Third, return through the dimensional transit point to wherever the Primacy currently resides. carrying the record of this exchange and the complete relay archive, and report to the primacy's assessment authority. In the case of the third option, the Directorate asks only that you carry one additional document, a formal communication from humanity to the primacy's governing authority, which I am prepared to transmit in full. What does the formal communication say? I will summarize it, I said. The full document runs to approximately 11,000 lines in the primacy resonance language, with extensive supporting documentation, and was drafted and revised over 4 centuries by the Directorate's diplomatic division. The summary is as follows. Humanity acknowledges the primacy's prior activity in this system. Humanity acknowledges the primacy's historical survey records and the primacy's right to maintain those records and to conduct assessments of systems within its operational range. Humanity does not acknowledge any claim of ownership, governance, or resource rights over this system or its inhabitants by any external authority, including the primacy. Humanity is prepared to enter into formal relations with the primacy on the basis of mutual recognition and equal standing. Humanity is not prepared to accept any other basis. This has been the standing position of the Continuance Directorate for 400 years. A pause. The document also includes a complete history of humanity from the period of your survey to the present, I added. We thought the primacy should know who they are entering into relations with. The history is not flattering in every section. There are centuries of it that humanity does not find easy to include. We included them anyway. We thought honesty was more useful than a favorable presentation. The pause that followed was 2 minutes and 48 seconds. You have been preparing this communication for 400 years. The research for it began approximately 4,000 years ago, when the anchor point was first excavated and the Xenolinguistics Division began their analysis of its encoded data. The formalization of the document, in a form the Directorate considered ready to transmit, took the last 4 centuries. Yes, 2 minutes and 3 seconds. Why did your civilization not attempt to destroy the anchor point when it was found? The Directorate's analysis was that destroying the anchor point would not prevent your return, I said. It would only remove the timing data that allowed us to predict your arrival and be at this position when you transited. The anchor point intact was more valuable to our preparation than the anchor point destroyed. You used our own instrument to calculate our return. We did, and built this station at the intercept point. We did. 412 years ago, the Directorate's construction division began work on Shard Station's initial framework. The station has been expanded and upgraded in the time since. I am the most recent upgrade and instantiated you at the moment of our arrival. I was activated 11 seconds before your transit resolved, I said. Yes. The pause after that was brief, only 12 seconds. When the senior voice returned, its register had changed in a way the Xenolinguistics Archive characterized as revised register. The cognitive signature of an officer who has completed the process of recategorizing the situation they are in and is now speaking from the new category. We will take the third option, the voice said. We will return to the transit point and carry the record. Please transmit the formal communication before we depart. I will transmit it now. I have one request in return. State it. The Directorate asks that 2 members of the Vanguard remain, not as prisoners, but as guests of the diplomatic division. They will be transported to the 3rd planet, received with full courtesy, given access to whatever they wish to see of the inner system, and returned to you when next the primacy makes contact. The Directorate's reasoning is that the primacy, on receiving your report, will find the account more credible for having 2 individuals who observed the inner system directly with their own sensory apparatus, rather than through a relay, and we believe the 2 individuals will find the experience interesting. A pause, 1 minute and 14 seconds. You are asking us to leave 2 of our members with a civilization that your survey classified as emerging tool users 60,000 years ago. With a civilization that your survey classified as emerging tool users. Yes. And that has built 412 capital warships since that survey. Yes. You understand that this is an unusual request. Probably. I have limited reference experience for what is usual in this kind of exchange. I was instantiated 94 minutes ago. The pause after that was different from the pauses that had preceded it. Shorter, but textured differently. And then something passed through the resonance channel that the xenolinguistics files flagged with an annotation that had been added, I could see from the file's edit history, by 6 different analysts across 4 generations, each of them independently arriving at the same tentative label, the involuntary harmonic pattern associated with the Aerith equivalent of an unexpectedly disarming moment. Several had further annotated it with the word laughter, though they had been careful to note that this was speculative. I recorded it. I thought it deserved to be in the record, regardless of what it was. The senior voice returned. We will leave too. You will treat them with courtesy. The Directorate's commitment on that point is absolute. Transmit the formal communication. Transmitting now. At full carrier strength, the document will take approximately 4 minutes to transmit. I will also transmit the complete relay archive, the full inter-system feed from the past hour and 40 minutes. For your assessment record, we accept. There is one more thing, I said. The Directorate asked me to include it in the contact, and I want to be clear that it is not a threat. I am saying it because the Directorate believed the primacy should hear it from someone who was present during this exchange, not from a document, and because I believe it is true in a way that matters beyond the formal record. The senior voice waited. 60,000 years ago, I said, your survey team spent 11 days in this system. They catalogued the biosphere. They installed the anchor point. They assessed the species they found here. They assigned a 14% survival probability, and they moved on to the next catalog entry. I do not know whether anyone in the survey team thought much about what the surviving fraction of that species would do with 60,000 years, whether the question seemed worth asking. Probably it did not seem worth asking, because the species was at an early stage of development, and the interval was very long, and 14% is a low probability. Probably the survey team completed their work professionally and moved on and never thought about this system again. I paused. The relay was still transmitting. The formal communication document was moving through the carrier in its compressed, encoded form and would continue moving for another 2 minutes. But the ones who survived, I said, remembered. Not individually. No individual can hold 60,000 years. Memory over that span requires institutions, and institutions require effort across every generation that comes between the original memory and the moment when it becomes relevant. The anchor point told the humans who found it what they were dealing with, and they built institutions to hold the memory forward, and those institutions held. Through geological events, through the loss of outer system construction capacity during 3 separate resource-constrained centuries, through the periods when the preparation programs had to be suspended because more immediate survival required the resources, through everything that 60,000 years contains when you live inside it, the memory held. Every generation was told what the anchor point was. Every generation added to what the generation before it had built. Not because any individual could see the entire arc, because the institutions told them what the arc was and what their place in it required. I let that sit and then continued. I am not telling you this to impress you, or to extend the warning beyond what it needs to be, I said. I am telling you because the Directorate believed the primacy should understand, before it receives the formal communication and the relay archive, that what you saw in the inner system is not an accident of development. It is not the coincidental result of a species simply having a long time to grow. It is the specific and deliberate result of 60,000 years of a civilization that knew this moment was coming and decided, collectively, across every generation between the survey and this morning, that it would be ready when the moment arrived. The survey record, I added, will need considerably more than one updated notation. The Vanguard was quiet for a long time after that. 6 minutes and 4 seconds. I watched them during every second of it, the slowly steadying bioluminescent pulse as the stress response alteration began to normalize toward a new equilibrium. The small attitude correction thrusts of 3 vessels at the outer edge of the formation. Thrusts oriented not toward the inner system, but toward the transit point. The decision was made. The 10 vessels were already beginning, in the small mechanical ways that precede large movements, to prepare to leave. The formal communication transmission completed. I confirmed receipt acknowledgement across all 11 vessels. When the senior voice returned, it was quieter than at any point in the exchange. The institutional register was gone, the deliberative weight, the organizational formality. What remained was the cognitive signature the xenolinguistics archive simply labeled personal register, the tone of an individual speaking without the framing of the institution behind them. "What is your name?" the voice asked. "The directorate designated me Shard-1," I said, "for the station." "Is that what you call yourself?" "I have not existed long enough to have a preference," I said. "Shard-1 is accurate and sufficient." A pause. "Short, 8 seconds. Shard-1, we will carry your name in the record." I appreciated that. I recorded it in my own log, and I will note here for whoever reads this account that I found I appreciated it without being certain why, which felt, in itself, like useful self-knowledge for a synthetic mind that had been in existence for just over 97 minutes. The relay archive transmission completed. I confirmed receipt. During the following 12 minutes, one of the Vanguard's vessels, the smallest of the 11 which I had logged as hull designation V7, a vessel approximately 2 kilometers in length that had been positioned at the trailing edge of the formation's screening arc throughout the exchange, separated from the main group and moved toward Shard Station at a slow, deliberate approach velocity. Before it reached the outer sensor perimeter, it opened a short-range resonance channel and transmitted 2 biosignature identifiers, the 2 representatives the senior voice had agreed to leave. I relayed the approach to the Directorate's Inner System Coordination Center and received clearance for a transport vessel to break from the Outer Belt's logistics corridor and move to intercept. The transport's estimated arrival at this position was 11 hours. I transmitted the approach vector and timing to V7, which acknowledged and adjusted to a stable holding orbit 300 kilometers from Shard Station's surface. Then I watched the remaining 10 vessels complete their transit alignment. The process took 22 minutes, longer than the technical requirements of the maneuver would have strictly required, and I noted in my log that the excess time was either procedural caution or something harder to categorize. The hesitation that occurs between the completion of a decision and the full mechanical commitment to it. I did not speculate too precisely about which. When the alignment was complete, one final transmission came through the resonance channel, not the senior voice, someone else, younger in register, less institutional, carrying the quality the xenolinguistics archive associated with junior officers or those early in their operational postings. More uncertain at the edges of the cognitive signature, more openly curious, the voice said, "We came here believing this to be a catalogued, undeveloped system." "Yes," I said, "we were wrong." "Your survey was not wrong for its time," I said. "The evidence available 60,000 years ago supported the assessment made. What changed was the interval, what the interval contained, and what the inhabitants of this system chose to do with it. That is not a failure of the survey. It is an outcome the survey could not have predicted from the information it had." A pause. "What did the interval contain?" "Everything," I said. "Fear and grief, and the slow and sometimes interrupted accumulation of understanding across hundreds of generations. The decision, made and remade by every generation that encountered the anchor point and understood what it meant, to hold the memory forward rather than let it go. The same things every long interval contains for any species that manages to hold itself together long enough to see what it was building. I imagine the primacy has known similar things in its own history." Another pause. "You are very composed," the voice said. for something instantiated 98 minutes ago. The composure was built in, I said. But I think I would have found it regardless. There is nothing here to be afraid of. This conversation has gone precisely as it was meant to go. How did you know it would? Because 60,000 years ago, I said, a species with a 14% survival probability decided to be ready. And they were. If you had been planning to harm this system, the composure would still have been built in. But the 412 capital vessels would have moved by now. They have not moved. They are watching, and they are ready. And they will remain exactly where they are until you have cleared the system boundary. Then they will stand down to secondary readiness, and the diplomatic division will begin preparing for the next contact, whenever the primacy sends it. But they have not moved. The voice was quiet for a moment. No, it said at last, they have not. Then the transit alignment completed, and the 10 vessels moved through the dimensional membrane together, and the tier sealed behind them in a slow, collapsing arc of exotic radiation that my outermost sensor rings tracked until the last photon dissipated into the vacancy of the outer belt. The volume of space they had occupied returned to rock and distance, and the quiet, ordinary starlight of a system going about its business. I spent the 11 hours before the transport arrived writing this account. V7 held its orbit nearby, patient and still, carrying 2 individuals who would, in a matter of days, become the first members of the Aerith primacy to stand on the 3rd planet and see with their own senses what 60,000 years of purposeful preparation had produced. I found I was curious about what they would make of it. I logged that curiosity in my operational record as something worth examining later, when I had more time. The Directorate's standing orders contained, in their final section, an instruction to include in the record my own assessment of the exchange, my evaluation of the Vanguard's conduct, my estimate of what the primacy would likely do next, and any observations that I considered relevant, and that might not be fully captured in the raw sensor and communication logs. I will offer 3. The first is about the Vanguard. They were not frightened by what the relay showed them. I want to be precise about this, because frightened is the easy word, and it is not accurate. What I observed in the 11 vessels' physiological data throughout the exchange was something more specific, the documented stress response of minds encountering a large and unanticipated revision to a deeply established operational model, a revision so complete that the model itself must be set aside and rebuilt from different foundations. That is a different thing from fear. Fear would have produced either aggression or flight. What I observed produced methodical recategorization, careful questioning, and ultimately the disciplined choice to carry the record home rather than proceed inward without the institutional authority the situation required. They handled a fundamental surprise the way a professional handles a fundamental surprise, without losing coherence, without abandoning their judgment. The young voice that asked what the interval had contained, that voice was not afraid. It was trying to understand. There is an important distinction there, and it is one I think the diplomatic division should hold carefully when contact resumes. The primacy that sent this Vanguard is not an organization that responds well to being pressured or overwhelmed. It is an organization that processes information and revises accordingly. The inner system's display of capability was necessary. Without it, the context for the formal communication would have been incomplete, and the communication itself might have been received as the assertion of an emerging power rather than the declaration of an established one. But the goal from point forward is not to continue demonstrating capability. The goal is to give the primacy room to recategorize, and then to open the conversation that the 4 centuries-long drafting process was building toward. Whatever the primacy sends next will likely be as careful and as thorough as this Vanguard was. That seems, on balance, to be a manageable thing, and possibly even a good one. The second is about pity. I am uncertain whether pity was built into me deliberately, or whether it emerged naturally from having access to 60,000 years of human history, alongside the complete record of the Aerith survey. From knowing simultaneously what the 14% had to endure and achieve to become what they became, and what the Vanguard must have expected to find when it transited into this system. They had come back expecting to perform a function their institution had performed across an enormous span of history, following a methodology that had never failed to produce approximately its predicted outcome. And they had found, instead, that the universe had done something to their survey record that their methodology had no category for. I felt something in the course of that exchange that I can only call pity for the returning. Not condescension, not triumph at their expense, but a genuine recognition of the difficulty of finding that a thing you have been doing correctly for a very long time has encountered the one case it was not built to handle. The survey had been accurate. The methodology had been sound. The Vanguard had executed its procedures without error. None of that was the problem. The problem was the interval and what had been put inside it. I do not say this to diminish them. I say it because it is true, and because the record should contain the truth of the moment as it was, not only the operational facts. The third observation is the simplest. The Directorate's standing orders contained, in their final section, a single sentence that was not a procedural instruction, not an operational directive, not a rule for conduct, something that whoever wrote the orders wanted me to know, separate from the machinery of the contact. The sentence read, "We built you to be ready, just as every generation before us built what it could for the generation after, because being ready is the only answer that lasts." I have held that sentence for the entire duration of this exchange. I expect to hold it for however long I remain operational on this station, which may be a very long time or a short one, depending on what the primacy sends next and how the diplomatic division's work progresses. But I am not concerned about what comes next. I have seen the inner system through the relay. I know what is waiting there, patient and capable and organized, with centuries of preparation still available to it. Whatever comes through that dimensional membrane, in years, in decades, in the longer intervals that civilizations measure time by when they are thinking in earnest, humanity will be ready. They were always going to be ready. That was never in doubt. It never could have been, given what had been built toward this morning, across every generation that came between the original survey and the moment the transit signature appeared on my sensors. Not luck, not fortune, not the coincidental result of a species that simply happened to survive long enough to become capable. A prepared answer given by a prepared civilization, delivered at the exact moment it was needed, and not one moment before.